Hello and welcome to Jinnah Institute's first session of our In Conversation series, which is to bring expert interactions to a wider audience. This is the first in a series of discussions on democracy, governance, human rights, and the economy. And today we have a panel with us of experts who will talk about law and democracy and the many situations that Pakistan is going through as we calibrate a new constitutional arrangement. There are calls for having a presidential system. There are calls for redoing parliamentary constitutional freedoms. And so while all of that takes shape on our media, in our streets and parliament, we thought we'd bring together a group of experts to talk through all of that. And we are fortunate to have with us Barrister Sara Belal, the Executive Director of Justice Project Pakistan, Mr. Zafarullah Khan, civic educator and human rights defender, Mr. Babar Sattar, a lawyer and columnist. I'd like to first of all, Babar Sattar Sahab, with you and to ask you what the nature of the state is. In our discussions before this conversation, we're discussing that the state has gotten harder. It has always been a hard state. But in your view, what nature and shape and direction is the state taking now?
There was a very interesting article I read back in 2007, which was talking about the survivability of democracy in developing states. And the argument was that developing states can tend to become predatory states. And when they become predatory states, they nurture and sustain predatory societies. And then it's a vicious cycle. Because the state is predatory, the society is predatory, and whoever from the society aspires to join the state also joins with that preconception. Which is interesting because that's kind of what we've seen. Political parties calling for change, but coming in and doing exactly the same thing. And even अगर आप civil military mix में भी उसे देखें, तो even since Aisha Jalal, the argument has been that the civilian regimes function like military regimes, despite the fact that they are democratically elected. And so the ordinary people don't really get the benefit of that democracy. There is no trickle down, and you can't really feel the difference. And so that is what increases the acceptance of dictatorial regimes as well, or authoritarian regimes when they come in the shape of military. So I think, so that's one way of looking at the state. The other way of looking at the state is that we've had these 10-year cycles where the militaries come in, and then we see an evolution of democracy, and then people getting disgruntled by democracy, and then leading to another cycle of military control. So there are those 10-year cycles, and this time it's been an experiment where we're seeing an elected government at the end of that 10-year cycle, which is for the first time completely in sync with the military. And so the argument is that this is military that has honed its skill to actually control democracy from behind the curtain, and that's why this is a new experiment. So I think that's the second way of looking at what the state is like. And the third way is just evaluating that the constitutional state. There is the executive and the judiciary and the legislature, and then to see how effectively they're performing their functions. And here, there is an all-powerful executive that we see. We saw a time when we thought that the judiciary, which historically had not been independent, was getting independent for the first time, post-lawyers movement and Iftikhar Chaudhry and all of that, to a point where there is a sense, or at least that's the cynical sense, that the judiciary has gone back to being the B team of the establishment like it traditionally has been. And if the judiciary cannot perform the functions of actually negotiating the relationship between the citizen and an all-powerful state, then the citizen really has nowhere to go. And so, because that check isn't functional, consequently, the quality of democracy then goes down. So I guess there are multiple ways of articulating what the state is like. But in my view, not that I'm a pessimistic person, but none of this is looking pretty right now.
Zafarullah Sahab, so this talk of the trickle down in democracy, of constitutional entitlements, How does that happen in your view in Pakistan? How is that currently happening, and what is the role of the judiciary?
Uh, it is a very long question. Of course, Pakistan as a post-colonial state, the first thing it tried to do was on 12th August 1947, because during our independence struggle, there was no Bill of Rights. The first committee which was constituted, and Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder himself, headed that. It was Committee on Fundamental Rights of the Citizens. And even after 73 years, we are facing the same dilemmas, despite having aspirations to offer a better deal to the citizens of Pakistan. In 1956 Constitution, we had a chapter on fundamental rights, and the debates were that while we have agreed 1948's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and one of the member of the parliament, Shaista Ikramullah, was part of that process, that we have agreed what more we can offer to the citizens. Then comes the disruption, and in 1962 Constitution, there was no chapter of fundamental rights. Of course, it was brought back through the First Amendment. Same debate happened during 1973 Constitution. Problem with our fundamental rights chapter is that there is too much weight of ifs and buts, subject to reasonable restrictions, subject to law, subject to public morality and all. That hampered, in fact, translating those black letter laws or words into the lived sociology or the lived experience of the society and the state. Of course, adjudication had to be done by the judiciary, but the disruption phase, whenever there is martial law, the chapter related to fundamental rights is suspended. So the taste of that fruit has never trickled down to the people. And then we are a very colonial state where we have a steel frame of bureaucracy, colonial institution of military, and only odd indigenous is politics, which has either deteriorated or it has shown its resilience on many times. But I would say there are so many cases in which judiciary tried to uphold, but of course you don't have too much case law which inspires you that these rights were given when they were being denied to the citizens of Pakistan through some kind of prudent jurisprudence.
That's interesting, Sarah. This so in case law, and I know that you've been agitating for reform. What space have you found as an activist, and what agitations are you taking forward with this government?
So, just a couple of things to just in terms of what's been discussed. I think I do agree with everything that has been said before. But as a lawyer, fundamentally, I think that Pakistan offers, the judiciary and the culture here offers some really interesting opportunities. So, the amount or the rich tradition of judicial review that we have of executive action, and how robustly the courts do consider it within their power to review executive action was something that surprised me a lot when I first came here. I studied in England, and the level of public law or the zeal with which public law was kind of practiced here was new to me. When it intersects with fundamental rights, I just think that, so as a lawyer, I would say that the onus is on me to bring those interesting challenges, right? I disagree that the judiciary is something like this monolith that exists outside and above the society within which it inhabits. The judiciary is made up of mostly men that are citizens of the same society, of the same country, and live in that same community over which they're adjudicating. So they do come with their own experience, lived experience outside of the courtroom, right? And I'm very conscious of that when we present our challenges before the court. To know that you're not arguing before God, but you're arguing before a member of the same community. I mean, I think that tailors the way that you bring those challenges with fundamental rights and how, our journey towards implementing them for the common person in Pakistan has, been along a pendulum. Sometimes, the courts have been more receptive to it and sometimes not. But I also think that the big fundamental rights cases that I've read so far in Pakistan, and my knowledge is limited, have been like these big political cases, right? Of somebody of a lot of power that was, whose rights were violated. And so those are the seminal fundamental rights cases. We're very interested in developing the jurisprudence for common people who are suffering fundamental rights abuses and the way that jurisprudence is developing. And we find there to be a lot more room for the judges to consider because the stakes might not be as high. So the jurisprudence that comes out is a little bit richer. So, it's the job of a lawyer, who does the kind of work that we do, to really look at the stakeholders involved and the elements involved, and to tailor our strategy inside and outside the courtroom to extract the best relief for our clients, in the situation that we are given. So in that sense, I think Pakistan offers a very interesting place, full of potential to bring in the right challenges. And we've seen the courts respond to those over the years. I mean, post-conviction cases for stays of execution 4 years ago when the moratorium were lifted were completely not entertained. And now you have 5 to 6, 7 cases before the Supreme Court that are on the second round of post-conviction appeals. And these are just of common people, right? Who, you can see nothing stays the same. So I think the same goes for the judiciary.
So Babar Sahab, there is also the argument that on the one hand, the judiciary is being the handmaiden of a state which is predatory, as you said. But also on the other hand, we see landmark decisions like the Askia Bibi, which is, was celebrated for being a seminal shift in how liberal the judiciary can be. How do you see these competing tendencies within Pakistan's judiciary sort of play out against each other or against each other?
So hard cases are cases where there are political consequences. Yeah. And as Ronald Dworkin wrote that, hard cases are made for bad case law because of the consequences. And so everyone is conscious as to what is being produced here. But they're also the gauge of how non-partisan and independent the judiciary really is, because that's where the consequences are. In a situation where there are no stakes on the other side, and I agree with Sarah, good things happen in courts all the time, on an everyday basis. But the court doesn't really have to be a leveler in that situation, because it's not like there's one powerful entity or somebody's really pushing for somebody. Unfairness has happened, injustice has been meted out, and it's a question of correction. Bad systems, investigation has not been done right, prosecution has been conducted in a reckless manner, and so it's a bad judgment which can be corrected. But it's these other politically consequential cases where you determine whether the judiciary is standing. There's an Article 7 in the Constitution which defines the state, doesn't include the judiciary. Doesn't include the judiciary because judiciary is not a part of the state as far as the fundamental rights are concerned. Sure. Why? Because it has to interpret, protect, and enforce those rights. And so that's where you have to look at what the judiciary is really doing as an institution. So you will find great case law saying the role of the judiciary is to expand the scope of fundamental rights. And yet we see that there is, all around, over the last 8 years, there's been a contraction of fundamental rights in this country. If we go right by right, we're living in an age of contraction of fundamental rights, whether it's the military courts, whether it's a right to liberty, dignity, freedom of speech. You can take or religious freedom for that matter. And then there are exceptions, and those exceptions are accounted not by an institutional development of thinking.
Right.
It's because of individuals. So I can say this might be a controversial statement. If there was no Justice Khosa, there wouldn't be a decrease in the number of death penalty cases pending. So this one man, if you look at the number of cases he's single-handedly disposed of over the last 8 years, will account for what has happened to the criminal law docket in the Supreme Court. So you take out one man, and then you look at institutional performance. It's very interesting, the picture that you see. Asia Bibi, same thing. So traditionally in blasphemy cases, the problem was that, at trial court, because of the pressure of the Maulvi and everyone else, there'd be a conviction. It would go to the High Court. That would create a distance between the event and the excitement of the local community and the High Court appeal. And the High Court would annul it, and the matter would end there. But this was a case where the excitement didn't end. The High Court didn't annul it. And for the first time, this high-profile case came all the way to the Supreme Court, and that was aligned then with a state which was covertly supporting a religious group that was actually marching against Asia and in favor of Mumtaz Qadri. And so then it became more of an issue for the judiciary's own sustenance. The Supreme Court did convict and hang Mumtaz Qadri. And so if you were to roll back, and there was no rollback, we saw that in the Apara case, there was no rollback till the time that the same leadership stood there, abused not only the judiciary but also the military's top leadership. That's when the rollback happened. So when the creation of the state actually attacked the state itself is when it was rolled back. And it was in that environment that the review was decided, as we now know. So I think it's very interesting how some of these progressive things also come out. So there are individuals, and then there is a power explanation of how things happen. And that, to me, as a lawyer, is not a gauge of the institutional evolution or the growth of fundamental rights. So we've seen historically that the judiciary has aligned itself to power. At any time when a dictator has been in power, they've endorsed martial laws, and at any time that a dictator has been out of power, they've said martial law is a terrible thing. And I don't see that pattern is changing. I hope I'm wrong, but that's a depressing thought.
It is often said that constitutions are living documents that can be interpreted, reinterpreted with every new phase of history. What is, in your view, the changing nature of fundamental rights in Pakistan?
Of course, constitutions are organic, they evolve. There was one very interesting study done by Chicago University, an average lifespan of a constitution. Although we can find constitutions as old as 200 years, but when they calculated statistically, it was their inference was that average life of a constitution is 17 years. If you correlate it with Ibn Khaldun's cycle of history, that means reality has to be reinterpreted or society has to be rejuvenated within that time frame. But we are living in very interesting times. These are very interesting times in many ways. The crises or the problems we are talking about Pakistan, they are not only confined to Pakistan. If borrow from classical liberal political philosophy, the state was always envisaged as a necessary evil. But that necessary evil was redefined by non-state actors.
Right.
State had traditionally monopoly over violence. The non-state actors exhibited they can do much better. State had monopoly over intelligence. WikiLeaks said no. Now the modern technologies can defeat on certain occasions the state operators. State had the resources, financial resources. Again, the corporatization of the world, there were many companies which were able to offer much more than the. So in that changing nature, I was a student at London School of Economics when this Labour government, with the slogan "New Labour, New England," we used to call it contentless discourse. But if you look at contemporary world, Brexit, state is at war with itself. Hindutva, state is at war with itself. America first, state is at war with itself. In Pakistan as well, sociology has changed. Borrowing from Hamza Alvi's thesis of salaries, in 70s, people were given passports and labor opportunities in the Middle East. A whole sociology changed if you travel along the GT road. Architecture changed, the kind of shops changed, private education came, private hospitals came. Now citizens were not looking for favors from the state. They were seeking justice and respect. If you allow me to describe this new class as a moneyed class, they want state to respond totally differently. And it impacts, if I correlate with recent cases which were adjudicated. By the way, our judiciary has not evolved in organic way. The cases which, if the Khar Muhammad Chaudhry picked up, nobody followed them. Tasadduq Jilani Sahab, minorities case, nobody followed that. Urdu by Jawad Khaja, consolidation of law by Jawad Khaja, accurate printing of laws by him, nobody followed it. Same goes water crisis, population by Zakir Nizar, nobody followed that. Because these were individual aspirations. And what happened at that time? I, as a citizen, was worried. My constitution says in Article 25, where right to education is acknowledged for kids from particular age. You know what Supreme Court was adjudicating? Whether private schools can charge fee during summer vacations or not. And if they can charge, how much? Water is essential for living. My Supreme Court was adjudicating companies are paying enough tax on water extraction or not.
Right.
Health is a fundamental right, of course not elaborately explained in the Constitution. You know what my Supreme Court was deciding? Stunt could be bought in 100,000 rupees or 150,000 rupees or 200. It is privatization of rights. It is, I would say, a departure from the envisaged, the constitutionally commanded role of the Supreme Court. I call it privatization of the rights. Then how our rights have evolved? Of course, Parliament can decide as a brain within the trichotomy. They gave us rights. We have a series of LFOs, PCOs, RCOs. Hundreds of times Constitution was amended through the stroke of pen. Not even a single right, fundamental right, was added to the chapter, whereas lengthy chapters were added for Shariat code, this, that, and all. Not even a single right. It comes from the democratic domain. Parliament went a step ahead. When traditional judiciary was not dispensing justice, Parliament gifted National Commission for Human Rights. Executive crippled it. It had powers to take suo motu over violations, many issues which we talk. National Commission on Status of Women. They won a very brilliant case against Jirga system and all. उसके rules नहीं बने अभी बहुत अरसा तक. They couldn't employ professionals. Child Rights Commission, gift of Parliament, again not operationalized. So what we have to look at, society is facing, I say, it is a classical case of troubled trichotomy. Or agar, if your program allows me, Mahmood, decline, progress could be uneven, but decline is spread all across in the same manner. Military is conceived as a very powerful institution. One army chief does same thing, which is combating terrorism and extremism. His project's name is Zafarullah. Same work against same actors. The new chief calls it Batul Prasad. Where is continuity? Same goes for the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, I can quote you on many occasions. For instance, in Haji Saifullah case, when General Zia said that Junejo's government was defaulting on implementation of, or Islamization process, the court verdict says no single article enjoys supremacy over the other. I am in the galaxy of two barristers. I'm a political scientist. I haven't studied law. So their article 2A was not given superiority, but at a later stage, in another case, they said it is the defining article. Supreme Court was attacked, all were acquitted. At another stage, same case, same people required, they were punished. A Riba case, at one stage, different decision. So for fundamental rights, I would say the state of Pakistan, of course, its nature is changing, its sociology is changing, its economy is changing. It is the sixth largest in terms of population. We don't have only state-controlled economy. Ke Badshah Salamat ko salam karenge to zinda rahenge. We have to understand that, and then we have to acknowledge state is for citizens. Citizens are not for state. If state is respecting the citizens, they will definitely uphold the state.
A lot of institutional memory there, which is always helpful to sort of situate our understanding of where law stands and the provision of new rights and demands for environmental rights, digital rights. Sara, my question to you is, how does one improve the gamut of the quality and access to law in Pakistan? And at the individual level, have any of those entitlements improved?
Yes. Zafarullah Sahab mentioned the creation of the National Commission for Human Rights and a bunch of these other statutory, quasi-statutory bodies. I mean, these are really, really important developments in the field of, human rights in Pakistan, as well as elevating the individual's rights in its negotiation with the state or the judiciary. Now, when the National Commission for Human Rights, and let's also see the background in which they were created. Parliament gifted these rights, but these really essentially came because we acceded to the GSP Plus, which obligated us to implement some of the core human rights treaties. So a lot of the lobbying that was done by human rights and activists to have these bodies created, there were geopolitical or even economic consequences which motivated the state to sign on to something as simple as trade tariffs that led to the actualization of these. Now, let's look at the National Commission. Their first term is over now after 4 years. And a lot of times it's a game changer. It's a new body, right? So it takes time for civil society even to catch up. Let alone the body itself to fit itself into this federal system in which it's kind of like an alien growth and not taken very seriously. But when civil society does engage with them, and we did a lot, we found it to be an exceptionally fruitful exercise. But they also need capacity building. So when we took the National Commission to Geneva for the global meeting of NHRIs, our embattled commissioners and our embattled NCHR really, within a global framework, saw that their journey from being born to being a toddler to walking is, yes, it's tough, but it's not unique. And they're not facing problems that other NHRIs have not faced in year 1 to 4. Right? So it's going to take time, but the fact that it's there is a critically important moment, and it's an opportunity, and it's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So I view that as progress, and I'm not impatient with it. I've got another 30 years in me to make sure that they do well, because that is a critical, like I said, in between the individual and the state. And it's the same with all the other statutory bodies. They're not going to just jump and be, perfect. It's going to be a progression, and during that progression, the most important part is, civil society learning to engage with them, because it's a game changer for civil society as well, right? I think there's some really important and exciting developments that have taken place. And when you look at the world, so yes, the far right is moving, we see it globally across the world having a resurgence and stuff. But you also see, like you pointed out, sir, some really interesting developments that are, that serve to equalize or counteract those trends, right? And we were talking about this before. I just don't believe in anything being static. And I view Pakistan's history as a pendulum. Sometimes it swings more towards, a certain way where a certain level of authority and, the courts acting a certain way. And then it swings, another way. And as human rights activists and indeed as citizens, I think it's our goal, and I think we all do that in our own way, to calibrate where the pendulum is going and where the trend is reversing, and really capitalize on the opportunities that it presents. So just like Babar, you pointed out with the Supreme Court and Justice Khosa, who has single-handedly overturned 75% of death row cases, but is he a man who doesn't believe in the death penalty? No, he actually believes very strongly in the concept of having the ultimate punishment, and he is somebody who has sentenced many people to death as well. But I don't view him as just this individual that came to, swing it a certain way. I think he is a part of a tradition. And my goal as an anti-death penalty lawyer is to capitalize on the time that he's there. So Justice Khosa is really big on fair trial and due process, right? That's what he stands for. And his 85% overturning is not ideological. It's really saying no more perjury, right? No more false implications. I'm going to clear the field on this issue. So as a lawyer, my challenge that I would want to bring before the Supreme Court, headed by Justice Khosa, is going to be cases that demonstrate how those failings have led to some other systemic failures, right? So it's but when it's another court, maybe the Gulzar court, I would bring different challenges around my same issue, but they would be pitched differently. And that's kind of where the skill stands. So in that sense, I might be younger, but when I look at my 40 years in Pakistan, I think we've been projected to fail so many times. During Zia's time, post Zia's time, now again. There's the joke I always have is if you go to a bookstore in Pakistan or at any of the airports and you take a picture, there's a whole shelf of like Pakistan on the brink or descent into chaos, we're about to blow up, we're about to die. We're still here. Maybe crawling and crippling, we're still here, we're going to be here for another while. So I'd rather focus on how we're going to take the next step and get the most out of whichever place the pendulum is. And I think that onus is on us.
I wanted to add one point.
Can I just bring in?
But one point about, because that will be for the benefit of your viewers. Yes, GSP Plus, we operationalize these institutions, but regarding creation of National Commission for Human Rights, I remember we had a consultation in 1997-98 in Islamabad. There is a huge struggle. And I remember the day because I was part of that process, ye banna chahiye. And when first time parliamentary committee met, some guy rang me, oh, but your application is not there. I said, no, we want operationalization of this commission. So it is indigenous thinking.
Absolutely.
And I would say it is a progress. And same goes for national status of women commission.
Correct.
It was after Beijing conference, government realized that there should be like that.
Oh, the Commission on Child Rights.
Child rights. Yeah. So in that way, we need to consolidate and build upon that. And Pakistan has amazing potential. मैं अक्सर कहता हूँ कि जो कुछ इस कौम के साथ हुआ है और आज भी इतनी resilience है, तो अगर इसे अच्छे मौके मिलेंगे तो they can create really a better future.
See,
I
we're
do
getting
want to
more
refer this to
optimistic.
Babar Saab. The conversation has suddenly turned very optimistic.
Good,
Saab,
Babar, now you have to be
some
optimistic.
gains and other reversals. At whatever level you view the state or society from, what are the sort of top 5 asks that you would have in your mind for security sector and rule of law sector reform?
Well, first of all, people cannot be left to chance, right? They can find a Sara Bilal who's, very passionate about the work she does, and she might be able to negotiate her way through the one progressive voice that there is on the bench and get relief. That's not the gauge of the efficacy of the system.
Right.
It shouldn't matter that Justice Khosa is on the bench, because everyone should be a Justice Khosa. And that is when we will not leave it to chance how people are being treated in an institutional fashion. That's not the case today. I, as a lawyer, have to pick my fights, and I can say, okay, this is not going to work. This might work. It will work before this bench, or not work before that bench. And so these are our daily fights. But when you look at the overall picture, what is happening? So that's one. We don't have an institutional approach. We have an individualistic approach. Zafarullah Sahab also pointed out the same in terms of the jurisprudence that the court is producing. We've sucked life out of rights as opposed to breathing oxygen into them. And the clearest example is Article 10A, which talks about due process and fair trial.
Right.
Now, this has been written into the Constitution through the 18th Amendment. Courts have historically said national justice has to be read into every statute. And here we see that this is dead letter. There is no jurisprudence on 10A saying that it's been elevated to the level of the Constitution. What's going to happen now? So that's a big problem. So you can write things in, you can create structures, but you can you can really suck the spirit out of them. So a structure being there can be a facade at times, is something that bothers me, if I'm being the devil's advocate.
That's
Third,
You're doing a good
there are
job.
3 foundational rights. There is life, there is dignity, and there is equality. And all the other rights are, in the paraphernalia then, expression, access to information, religion, etc. But these are the 3 foundational rights: dignity, life, and so life can be lost. And Sarah will have a lot more stories than I do on how life can be lost to completely whimsical and arbitrary circumstances. There is no concept of dignity here. None. There's no concept of dignity. We run media trials every day, we convict people, and that's the end of it. We're losing the distinction between convicts and accused in this country. And the government is saying, any accused, freedom of speech is gone. And this week we've had 3 news channels shut down, and they have no place to go. So this is an amazing environment where 3 channels are shut down, interviews are being pulled out, and there is nothing they can do. There is no institution they can go to. So what's happening to dignity and equality? The lesser said about it, the better it is. There's no equality. There's no legal equality. It depends on, if you've got resources, you've got different rights. If you are before the right judge, you've got different rights. If you're before the right investigator, you've got different rights. So it's extremely a game of chance right now. So and these are constitutionally determined rights. But the problem is, if the judiciary cannot protect itself against the state, right now we've got a Supreme Court judge who's facing a trial before the Supreme Judicial Council because of his irreverence to the state. Everyone understands that. He wrote a critical judgment, and he's got to be shown the door, not because he's going to be a disaster if he stays on, but because if you're going to control the state and everyone from behind the curtain, then people have to be sent the right message. It's a red line to be irreverent. So if a Supreme Court judge cannot protect himself, that's a message to all the other judges as to how they're going to behave. And if these judges cannot protect themselves, and we've got this latest scandal of Judge Arshad Malik, who's now being transferred without a full-fledged inquiry into whether he was being blackmailed, if he was being blackmailed, who was blackmailing him, whether it was Nawaz Sharif, whether it was the state. It's a complete scandal, which takes confidence away from the ordinary person that they're going to be before a judge who will act who will not be coerced, he will not be cajoled, and he will deliver a judgment on the basis of the merits of the case. And the judiciary is being unable to do anything to restore that confidence, which is essential for this democracy and this trichotomy of powers to function. So these are just the most obvious things before you. If this structure is to function, people should conceive for it to function. If it's not going to function, then we don't need it. If the judiciary is not independent, what is it that we're saying? We're saying we have a state that we can trust, or we have a state. So the foundational concept of rule of law is that the executive authority is to be controlled. State can only do what it is authorized by law to do, and citizens are free to do what they're not prevented from doing. So citizen has freedom, and the state is restricted. And the judiciary is there to protect that. Now, if you say that the accused is the same as convict, then we are saying that anyone that the state accuses is actually guilty. So then why do we need a judiciary? Why do we need a defense counsel? Why do we need Sara Belal? What does she do in court? She vigorously argues for somebody who's actually accused. And if we've already decided that he's guilty, then what conversation are we actually having? So somehow we've moved past a stage where not only do people not understand their rights, but the people as well as the state misunderstand the constitutional structure in such a fundamental way that even judges don't understand, I fear, and lawyers don't understand what their roles are, because we have to defend why we are defense counsel. It's pejorative to be defense counsel, because why would you morally stand up for somebody who's done reprehensible things if he's accused? That's the state we're at. So, it's kind of taking the conversation back to square one, where you've got to defend the most basic of things, that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, and everyone has a right to counsel, and everyone has a right not to be judged till they're proved guilty. So, I don't see a very rosy picture, unfortunately. I don't see introspection anywhere. I see an attempt for capture of the judiciary. Is that going to come through or not? Let's just see. I don't see a very vocal civil society. Instead of this structure that we have, the Human Rights Commission and more part of them, we've had the Human Rights Commission run by late Asma Jahangir, which was a much more vociferous advocate of fundamental rights and civil liberties than a state-run commission could possibly be. And we don't see many of those voices right now. Where are the Asma Jahangirs of today? And that's a depressing thought for me. The bar associations used to be really, really vocal. And they don't have a role. They didn't have a role when Saqib Nisar was running amok with the Constitution. We've got a PDM, which was the only resistance movement. It has been declared a traitor now. And we're afraid to talk about them. If we write about them, we're not going to get published. If we talk about them, the media cannot run with it. So that's where I'm looking at the state. Yes, there is a contraction and expansion of rights. Yes, 30 years down the line, 40 years down the line, there might be a change. But I don't see the movers and shakers of that progressive change right now. Where are they? Unfortunately, I hope we can do more and become those movers and shakers.
That's a very sobering thought. Sarah, taking a cue from what Babar Saab was saying, that activism needs a new generation, a new brand. There was a time when we had the Asma Jahangirs marching on the streets of Lahore, making fundamental rights come true. Do we need a new generation of torchbearers who can do that? Are we lacking in those numbers as activists?
No, I see immense potential here. I think Asma's legacy would be that it wasn't just this one voice, but she's inspired generations of people to come forth and have that voice. And I think it would be really depressing. The one thing that would depress me is that if we needed just one person to take her place, the idea would be that there are thousands of people taking her place and thousands of people from a different background, right? You know, this lady was, and the other women of the Women Action Forum who are our sheroes, they belonged to a particular time. They were reaction and symbolic of a particular time, and they took on, you know, they came from a particular background and they took on a particular dictator and beyond. But I think the beauty of history and progression is that you have, you know, they've inspired legions of people from all walks of life who will take on that cause. And you see that in Pakistan, whether it's the Okada farmers, you know, fighting for rights within their own communities to, you know, people all across Pakistan. So yes, it might be easier for, you know, somebody as charismatic and powerful as Asma to capture that limelight and to be that voice. But, you know, we're gonna help the state be better when all segments of society are advocating for their rights. And I see that in Pakistan. It's always been there and it's been there. It's more. And if you look at the young generation of activists and human rights defenders, they're myriad and they're diverse, and that's what it should be. It should not be people that look like me or come with my background. It should be different people. I also want to talk about this really interesting thing where, you know, again, we have this immense legacy of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, but I don't want it confused with the National Commission for Human Rights, because as a state body, it will embody a different journey and a different position, and I think that position is very important. It's also 4 years old, and the Human Rights Commission is 20 years old, 30 years old. So I think if we want to compare apples and oranges, and I absolutely agree with you, sir, like it would not have been there if it wasn't for the hard fought, like, you know, lobbying to actualize it. But now that it's there, it's not there alone, and it's there within a geopolitical setup, and its protectors are not just within, you know, the state, but, you know, NHRIs regionally band together. They you know, there's all these mechanisms that exist, and that's something that, by the way, gives me a lot of hope. When I first came to Pakistan, I was told categorically, international law, I don't know, Babar, if you got the same lecture, but international law does not apply in Pakistan. And that's just like you're scratching your head, and then after the fifth really important lawyer tells you, you know, just leave it at the door, you're just like, okay, maybe I'm missing something. And they were right, because if you had the guts to argue international law, especially on the criminal side, you'd get laughed out of court. But that's changing now, right? Because international law, whether we like it or not, does apply. And if it doesn't apply, then there are consequences. You know, they're not drastic yet, but the pendulum is shifting again. And to me, that accords more protection. So if we have a state that's in a particularly bad mood, or our pendulum is at a bad place, other things that are positive, such as the interaction with international mechanisms. I mean, Pakistan just got reviewed by the Human Rights Committee for the ICCPR, for the CAT committee. You know, one would say, oh, but what do these UN committees do? Well, they do something, because right after the CAT committee's review, the state actually took on, through the NCHR, a wide inquiry into accountability for the police and their torture, which was, you know, that we had documented from 2012. So, I mean, that level of an inquiry could have never been done. Then you could say, "Phir kya hua?" Well, it just came out, right? The report was in 2012. The CAT review was in 2016, 17, and the inquiry was in 2018. And now it concluded in 2019. Let's see what comes next. So, you know, I think I would think that these are interesting times, and I hope for many more interesting times for Pakistan.
Zafarullah Sahab, we've spoken about actors, process, institutions. Do you see opportunities in the system for law and democracy to have that power combination we've been waiting for?
Do we have any other choice?
Yes.
I'm a chronic optimist. We have done a lot of diagnosis. We have to realize that mistakes of the past could be covered. if you create a better future. Our tendency is try to rewrite history so
Right.
that our past was perfect and future we are doing nothing. If you ask me my menu, uh, democracy, freedom is a bird with two wings. One is the political, civil rights, and the other is economic rights. We have to see sometimes our political rights wing is broken, sometimes our economic rights wing is broken. For a balanced flight, we need to focus on both. And state, society, citizens have to strive for that. Secondly, when we say we want to create a rule of law based society, I had the opportunity to do research. On our statute book, we have three kind of laws, all with different intent. One bestowed by our colonial masters, and colonial intent was to control the subjects. We have reasonable number of still living laws, even our police act, our criminal procedure, penal code, and all substantive laws. Intent was to control. Then we have laws thrust upon us during the military regimes, collectively indemnified when we indemnified the martial law. And both these categories have never been discussed, debated, and deliberated in the democratic institution. And then the third set of law is given by the parliament. Of course, whether it has emanated from the executive requirement or as a private member bill. We need to embark on law reforms. And there is now example. Optimism comes from that. We used to have 8 laws governing our election system. And out of those 8, 4 were given by military regime, 4 were given, or you may say, enacted by the parliament. Now 8 laws consolidated into one. It brings predictability, both for the enforcer and those who will be impacted by that. We need to embark on similar kind of legal reforms so that we can enforce law. Secondly, we need to increase legal literacy and legal socialization. कौम की इंग्लिश में कम पार्ट्स आती हैं, सारे कवानीन अंग्रेजी में लिखे हैं और उसमें भी लातीनी का तड़का लगा हुआ होता है. We need to make it understandable, accessible. Constitutional literacy is another. मुझे बाज़ औक़ात लगता है कि वो ब्यूरोक्रेट जिसने इम्प्लीमेंट करना है, वो जज जिसे इम्प्लीमेंट करना है, and I can quote you अगर फन से के लिए बहुत सारे एपिसोड्स. एक दफ़ा सुप्रीम कोर्ट में एक मुकदमे की समाअत हो रही थी, बड़े सीनियर वकील आइन से कोर्ट कर रहे थे. जज साहब ने पूछा, आपके पास लगता है 18वीं तरमीम से पहले का? हाँ, तो जिस मुल्क में आइन की दुरुस्त कॉपी का हसूल मसला हो, we need constitutional literacy as well. And most important, मैं जिसका बहुत वकील हूँ, वो है कि हमने primacy of citizen supreme है. आप देखें, when we created first constitution, fundamental rights, bill of rights के इर्द-गिर्द पूरा structure बनता है. Our constitution is very proceduralist, legalistic. 73 ka constitution, when it was being framed, the first thing which they decided was the quantum of fundamental rights, because whole edifice has to be established and developed around that. So usme, if you don't give primacy to citizen or don't acknowledge his right to be governed democratically, we can have so many odd episodes. But if we want to offer better deal to our citizens, we have to respect constitution, we have to respect their right to be governed democratically, and lastly, our communication vectors. वो थानेदारी होता है, बंदा मरा पड़ा होता है, तय करते हैं तुम्हारे थाने की हदूद में था या मेरे. We have a troubled trichotomy where institutions first don't speak to each other, they speak at each other. These are, if I import a metaphor of body, parliament is like brain, executive is the psychomotive, judiciary is the immune system, whenever if you face any problem, and citizens are the core. Brain is sending message, psychomotive is responding in a negative manner or not according to the intended manner, it will be paralysis. We are suffering from that paralysis. We need to improve communication vectors. I have a faith, 207 million plus Pakistanis. हमारे पास reforms के अलावा choice क्या है?
Sorry. Babar Saab, you have the last word in terms of choices that you want to put on the table for us. Where does Pakistan go from here? We've spoken about the citizen and the new social contract. आप बताइए, आपके ज़हन में क्या है? What is your wish list?
Babar, don't be depressing.
No, I'm not. There is no inevitability of resilience. That is what we need to worry about a little bit. I think we've talked about the law, but we've got to talk about the spirit. Right? Some of us are raising kids. I've got little kids. So my hope is to raise kids, because these are the future citizens of this country, to raise kids who are irreverent towards authority. They are critical and they have dissenting voices, because that's going to happen across the dinner table. Because if you give them that space, then they will grow up to think that way and question authority and have critical voices. Because where is the introspection going to come in from? It has to come from citizens, and it's going to come from citizens if they've been socialized and trained to think in. And then what we lack, and at least that's been my experience, I have seen grown men in Islamabad lacking the ability to speak their minds. In ordinary conversations, in power environments, they're just looking to people and trying to figure out what the most powerful person on the table wishes to hear. And that's very, very depressing. Because Islamabad is a place where you have change of power every 4 or 5 years. So, we've seen those cycles. And that is very depressing in a society where people cannot speak their minds. And all of this can then be translated into fundamental rights, right to information, right to speech, etc., etc. But when you have a combination where there is servitude toward authority and there is conformity, you can go from being in a coercive state. We've all said that, there have been times where there have been coercive consensus during martial law, etc., etc. But then the pendulum swings the other way. But my fear is, what if a coercive consensus takes the form of a conformist consensus? And it happens in other societies. It has happened in other societies. And to make sure that that doesn't happen, we need these spirited people who question authority, so that we don't have a sense of disempowerment. We don't have a sense of lack of agency, which we have in our citizens, where you think you cannot change things. And because of that, you don't want to protest, or you don't want to resist because you think it's not going to help you. And then you fall for conspiracies because you think you're not in control of anything, and consequently it's all a conspiracy that you don't even know, but you're being made to act in a certain way. So I think it's that spirit. And that will obviously go back to both socializing young people and educating them. And I think that's where it all starts.
Well done, Babar. That was very optimistic.
Finally,
With that, we'd like to end
We have
this
optimism.
recording of our first conversation with experts. Finish it off in the language of, in a very poetic idiom where cautious optimism has been expressed, that justice is a bird with 2 wings. Do I get that correctly? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This
was
is
fun.
really good. This is really good. Thank you.